The auctioneer almost skipped it entirely. Allegheny County Equipment Auction, April 8, 1971. A Wednesday morning, the kind of gray Pittsburgh spring where the cold hangs on 2 weeks past its welcome. The lot was moving well. A solid international flatbed went for $2,800. $2 dump trucks sold before noon. A decent line of trailers moved steadily through the block. Then the clerk called Lot 31. All right, folks, last commercial vehicle of the day. 1953 Mack B61 Semi. No title, sold as is. Engine hasn't turned over since '62. She's been sitting in the county impound behind the Neville Island facility for 9 years. Starting bid $100. The truck sat at the far end of the row, away from the equipment that still had dignity. The cab was rust orange, where the red paint had surrendered to 9 years of river bottom weather. The chrome bulldog on the hood was green with oxidation. Both steer tires were flat and cracked through to the belts. The exhaust stacks were bent. And across the driver's door, in white spray paint, block letters. Junk. Come on, people, $100. Parts value alone on a B61. There are no parts worth having on that thing, said a voice from near the front. Laughter rippled through the crowd. The man who'd spoken was Eddie Caruso, owner of Caruso Mack Sales and Service in Carnegie, the largest Mack dealership in western Pennsylvania. He was 51 years old, thick through the middle, wearing a clean jacket with the Mack Bulldog embroidered on the chest. He sold new Mack semis and had opinions about old ones. That B61's been sitting in river air for 9 years, Caruso said, loud enough for the whole lot to hear. Blocks probably cracked, bearings are rust-welded. Whoever poured that last load of oil in her did it in the Eisenhower administration. He looked around at the crowd and grinned. That truck's not worth the spray paint on the door. More laughter. Someone near the back said something about good money after bad. The auctioneer tried again. $50 then, somebody give me 50. Silence. 25. Roy Schenk raised his hand. 25. Every head turned. He was 29 years old, standing near the back in a gray work jacket with a coal company patch on the shoulder and jeans that had been washed too many times to hold their color. He had the build of someone who'd spent his 20s loading things that didn't want to be moved, and the steady eyes of a man who didn't speak unless he had something worth saying. 25, the auctioneer confirmed. Do I hear 50? I'll tell you what I hear, Caruso called out. I hear a young man making a very expensive mistake. He turned toward Roy directly. Son, I sell Macks for a living. I know every B61 that ran these roads for 20 years. That specific truck had a cracked head gasket when it was impounded. 9 years later, that cracks a canyon. You'd spend 3 times your bid just finding out how bad the damage is. Roy looked at him. How much for a new B61? Caruso blinked. Loaded, 19,000. I've got $25. That's my point. No, Roy said, that's mine. He raised his hand. 50. The bidding went back and forth twice more before Roy said $400 into a lot that had gone very still. Caruso shook his head and turned away. Sold, the auctioneer said. $400 to the young man in the gray jacket. Roy walked to the payment table and counted out $400 in 20s and 10s. Caruso intercepted him at the cab door. I wasn't trying to embarrass you, Caruso said. His voice had changed. Less performance now. I've seen young guys spend everything they have on equipment that can't be saved. This truck. Mr. Caruso, Roy said, my father drove a Mack B61 for Consol Coal for 14 years. I grew up in the passenger seat of one. I know every sound this engine makes when it's right and every sound it makes when it's wrong. He put his hand on the cab door over the spray-painted word. This engine isn't making any sounds yet. That's the first problem I have to fix. Caruso looked at him for a long moment. What's the second problem? Getting it home. He turned and walked away. Let me tell you about Roy Schenk, because you need to understand where he came from to understand what came next. Roy was born in 1942 in Chartiers Township, Washington County, the second of 4 children of Walter and Dora Schenck. Walter drove Mack semis, coal runs, mostly, hauling through the western Pennsylvania routes, connecting the Greene County mines to the Monongahela River loading facilities. He drove for Consolidated Coal for 11 years, and then for a smaller independent called Tri-County Hauling for 3 more, before a back injury in 1961 ended his career at 47. Roy grew up understanding big trucks the way some boys understood horses, not as machines, but as working animals with moods and tolerances and particular sounds that meant particular things. Walter taught him that a diesel engine had a voice, and a good driver learned to listen to it before anything went wrong. "A truck'll tell you everything," Walter used to say. "You just have to stop talking long enough to hear it." When Walter's back gave out, the family lost its income. Roy took on extra shifts, helped his mother with the bills, and watched his father go quietly still the way men do when the work that defined them is taken away. Walter Schenck died in 1967 at 53. Roy had always thought it was something close to loss of purpose, the way a diesel runs rough when you take away the load it was built to carry. After the funeral, Roy sat in his father's kitchen chair for a long time, and when he got up, he knew 2 things. He was going to run his own hauling operation, and he was going to do it in a Mack his father would have recognized. He'd been saving for 4 years by the time the auction came around. He borrowed a flatbed trailer from a neighbor named Carl Purcell, who watched with obvious skepticism as Roy loaded the B-61 using hand tools, a hydraulic jack, and 45 minutes of patient work, getting the frozen steering loose enough to align the wheels with the trailer ramps. "You know what you're doing?" Carl asked. "I know what I'm trying to do," Roy said. "That's not the same thing." "No, but it's where you start." He got the Mack home to his father's garage on Neville Road. 2 bays, concrete floor, tools hung on pegboard in the arrangement Walter had established 20 years earlier and never changed. Roy had maintained that arrangement since the funeral. It seemed important. He spent the first night walking around the Mack with a flashlight. Caruso hadn't been wrong about the damage. The head gasket was cracked, carbon scoring on the block face where combustion gases had been escaping into the cooling system. The front main bearing was seized. Both valve covers had surface rust worked into the gasket surfaces. But the block itself was solid. Roy ran his hands along every surface, used a flashlight and a dental mirror to examine the cylinder bores, checked the deck surface with a straight edge his father had kept since 1955. The block was good. Something else had stopped this truck, not the block. Let me tell you what Roy found when he started looking seriously. In the second week, after he'd pulled the head and started assessing what he'd need, Roy noticed something about the oil pan. The drain plug had been safety wired. Not factory work. Someone had drilled a small hole through the plug hex and through the pan boss, run steel safety wire through both holes and twisted it tight. Military mechanics did this on aircraft engines, positive retention, nothing drains accidentally. Nobody safety wired an oil drain plug on a coal haul Mack semi. Roy unwired it and pulled the plug. The oil that came out was dark but not sludged. Fresh oil, the kind you put in something you intended to preserve, put there before the truck was parked. He drained the pan completely, then reached up inside with a flashlight to check the pickup tube. That's when he felt the irregularity. Along the inside rear wall of the pan, the casting was wrong. Not cracked wrong, different wrong. A rectangular section, maybe 6 inches by 4, where the metal was slightly thicker than the surrounding wall. The surface finish was different, not cast, welded. Someone had welded a sealed panel into the inside of the oil pan. Roy spent 20 minutes confirming what he was seeing. Then he sat on the creeper and stared at the underside of the Mack's engine and thought about safety-wired drain plugs and fresh oil in an impounded semi and a panel welded into a place where no panel should be. He thought about it for 3 days. Then he got the air chisel. The weld was clean work, full penetration, good beads. Whoever did it knew engines. It took Roy 40 minutes to cut through carefully enough to preserve the panel intact. He set it on the workbench. It was a steel box, welded shut on all sides, the size of a large hardcover book, coated in cosmoline, the same rust-preventive compound the military used on stored weapons. It had kept the metal perfect for 9 years in river air. Roy cut it open with a hacksaw, slow and careful. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 things. The first was money, banded stacks of bills, nothing newer than 1963. Roy counted it 3 times. $11,200. The second was a document, several pages, typewritten, with a notary stamp dated March 14, 1963. A detailed accounting of financial transactions, with names and dates and dollar amounts organized in careful columns. The third was a letter, handwritten, 3 pages on lined paper, dated April 2, 1963. Roy sat down on his father's stool and read it. To whoever finds this. My name is Thomas Edward Garrett. I drove for Tri-County hauling out of Carnegie from 1955 to 1963. This is my truck, or it was, until they took it from me. I am writing this because I am dying. The doctor says 6 months, maybe less. Stomach cancer. I have made my peace with that. What I have not made peace with is what happened to the men I worked with. In 1961, the owner of Tri-County Hauling, a man named Victor Lassiter, began falsifying the pension contribution records for his drivers. He was collecting the pension deductions from our paychecks. The money came out every week. We saw it on the stubs, but he was not remitting it to the Teamsters Fund. He was keeping it. I found out because I called the fund directly in August of 1962. They had no record of contributions for me or for any Tri-County driver going back to January of 1961. I confronted Lassiter. He fired me the next day. Roy stopped reading. He looked at the typewritten document again. It was a ledger, names on the left side, amounts and dates in columns. At the top, pension contributions withheld, Tri-County Hauling, 1961-1963. He went back to the letter. The attached document is a copy of the ledger I kept. I recorded every pay period, every deduction, every driver's name. 22 names, men who drove alongside me for years, men who paid into a pension they will never see because Lassiter stole it. I tried to go to the union. I was told the matter was under investigation. I tried the State Labor Board. 8 months passed, nothing. I am out of time to wait. I am sealing this ledger and this letter in my Mack because I do not trust what will happen to paper in a house after a man dies. My wife is not well. My son is 15. I do not know who will go through my things. The money is what I saved over 23 years of driving. It belongs to my son, Danny Garrett, living at my mother's house in Bridgeville after I am gone. If you find this, please get it to him. The ledger belongs to the 22 men on that list and to their families if they are gone. Try a lawyer, try a newspaper, try anyone who will listen. I do not know who you are or when you will find this, but if you are reading this, you are the person I was hoping would come along. Thomas Edward Garrett. April 2nd, 1963. Roy sat in his father's garage for a long time. He looked at the list of 22 names. The 4th name from the top was Walter Schenck. Roy's hands went absolutely still on the paper. His father had driven for Tri-County, 1961 to early 1962, exactly the period covered by Garrett's ledger. His father had paid into a pension fund that Lassiter was stealing. His father had paid into a pension he never received. Roy sat on his father's stool in his father's garage. Surrounded by his father's tools in the arrangement, Walter had never changed, and read his father's name on a stolen pension ledger that a dying man had hidden inside a Mack semi-engine in 1963. He folded the letter carefully, set it on the workbench, and went back to work. He needed something to do with his hands while he thought. Let me tell you about the next 6 months, because that's where the mechanical work and the legal truth ran alongside each other. Roy rebuilt the B-61 completely, bored the cylinders, reground the crankshaft, replaced all the bearings, rebuilt the head. He did the transmission himself, pulling the main shaft on a Saturday and spending 12 hours with it on the bench. He sourced the parts through a Mack truck salvage operation in Clayton, driving down twice with a list he'd made from the shop manual his father had kept since 1958. The work took 5 months. The Mack was back together by September. He also found a labor attorney in Pittsburgh named Gerald Foss. Foss read Garrett's ledger and was quiet for a long time. "This document is 28 years old," he said. "Yes." Tri-County Hauling dissolved in 1967. "I know, but the Teamsters Pension Fund is still operating. If contributions were collected and not remitted, the liability doesn't disappear when the company does." Foss looked at him. "You've done some research." "My father drove trucks his whole life. I learned how pensions work." Foss filed the claim in October 1971. He named all 22 drivers or their estates. Of the 22, 14 were still living. 8 had died, including Walter Schenck. Roy filed on behalf of his father's estate. The case took 3 years. Lassiter had died in 1969, which complicated but didn't eliminate the liability. The fund's attorneys fought every motion. Foss countered with Garrett's ledger, which was specific enough that it couldn't be dismissed. The settlement came through in 1974. 11 of the 14 living drivers received back contributions plus interest. 3 couldn't be located. The 8 estates received reduced settlements that still amounted to real money for families who'd been owed it for a decade. Roy's share from his father's estate was $4,200. He put it in savings and didn't touch it for 2 years. Then he used it as the down payment on a second Mack. As for Danny Garrett, Thomas Garrett's son, 15 years old in 1963, Roy found him through the Bridgeville phone directory in 1972. 24 years old, working in a machine shop in Pittsburgh. Roy drove to the machine shop and introduced himself. He handed Danny Garrett an envelope containing $11,200 in old bills, still legal tender. He explained where it had come from. He gave him a copy of his father's letter. Danny read the letter standing in the parking lot, still in his work clothes. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. "He hid it in the Mack," Danny said. "Yes." He always said that truck was the most solid thing he owned. "He was right," Roy said. "It kept everything safe for 9 years." "Did the other men get their money, the drivers?" "Most of them. Case settled last year." "My father would have wanted that more than this." He held up the envelope. "I know," Roy said, "but he wanted you to have it too. Let me tell you about Eddie Caruso, because this story has one more turn." In the fall of 1974, Roy had been running his rebuilt B-61 for 3 years. He had a reputation in western Pennsylvania as a man who could move coal loads on bad roads in bad weather. The mining companies had learned his number. He had more work than one truck could handle. Caruso's dealership was on Route 50 in Carnegie, and Roy drove past it twice a week. He'd never stopped. One afternoon in October, he stopped. Caruso was in the service bay when Roy walked in. He looked up, recognized the face, looked past Roy at the Mack parked in the lot. He walked out without saying anything and stood beside it. The paint was new, proper Mack red, deep and clean. The chrome was polished. The bulldog on the hood gleamed. The lettering on the door read Schenck Hauling in clean block letters. Caruso walked around the entire truck slowly. He checked the frame rails. He looked at the steer tires. He opened the hood and looked at the engine. "You rebuilt this," he said. "Yes." "The block." "Complete overhaul. Board .030 over. New bearings, new valves, rebuilt injection pump. Caruso closed the hood carefully. "This is good work," he said. It came out sounding slightly surprised. "Thank you." He looked at Roy. "I said some things at the auction." "You did." "I was wrong about the truck." "You were right that it was in bad shape," Roy said. "Right about the head gasket. Right that fixing it was going to cost time and money. You were looking at what you could see." He put his hand on the cab. "But you weren't looking at what it was worth to someone who knew how to fix it. That's a different calculation." Caruso was quiet. "What do you need?" he said finally. "A second truck. I've got more work than one rig can handle." Caruso took him inside. 2 hours later, Roy Schenck drove off the lot in a 1968 B model with 90,000 miles and a service history Caruso walked him through personally. The price was fair, better than fair. Roy ran both trucks for 11 years before expanding to 4. He retired in 1998 at 56, sold the business to his partner's son, who was 27, and reminded Roy of himself at that age. He kept the B61. It was in the garage on Neville Road the day he signed the sale papers, and it was there the day he died in 2019 at 77. His daughter found it there and couldn't bring herself to sell it. She drove it around the block once, on a cold November morning, just to hear the engine run. The Mack fired on the first crank. Ran smooth and strong, the way a B61 engine runs when someone has spent 20 years maintaining it correctly. She sat in the cab for a while after she pulled back into the garage. The seat was cracked leather, worn to the shape of her father's posture. The steering wheel was smooth where his hands had gripped it for decades. On the visor, tucked above the windshield, was a folded piece of paper, a photocopy of Thomas Garrett's letter, the original now in a Pittsburgh labor history archive. She took the letter down and read it. Then she folded it and put it back exactly where her father had kept it. Some trucks are built to outlast the men who drive them. Some secrets are sealed inside cast iron and hidden in river air for 9 years, waiting for the right set of hands to find them. And some debts, the ones made in theft and silence by men who thought they'd gotten away with it, have a way of finding their way home. Roy Schenck paid $400 for a Mack Semi and a pension his father never received, and a dying man's last act of honesty toward his crew. He got all 3. Not bad for $400 and the willingness to see past what everyone else had already written off.